It's telling me it's going.
Yes, it's on YouTube live.
We're live? Okay. So let me stop that and welcome you all. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are proud to say that we have colleagues and students and joining us from literally all over the world. For those of you who may be here for the first time, very quickly, I'll just share with you the dynamics of how we run the FINE seminar. Our speaker will present for about 45, 50 minutes. Definitely we try not to go over the hour because we understand that some of you may have something else coming up in an hour time. And after that, we switch to a session that we're very proud to have and rather unique across remote seminars. We engage for as long as an hour, if there's interest, with the speaker in a round of questions and answers that has proven very, very lively. We very much encourage the students to ask questions and participate. For asking the questions, as always, please just type a question mark in the chatting window. I'm not good at multitasking. I don't want to multitask. So I'm not going to be keeping my eyes on the chatting, otherwise I couldn't be listening and watching the speaker. Just type a question mark and we'll call your name to ask, to pose your question. So today it gives me huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Monique Borgerhoff Mulder, whom I've known for a long time since I was a grad student at the University of California, Davis. In fact, I think that my first graduate seminar, the first graduate seminar I ever took when I had just landed from Argentina was with Monique. And we were having this wonderful seminar in the confines of her home. And so I'll always remember those. Monique started her training doing her master's in social anthropology. And that is my timer, which I don't think you need. Social anthropology, and that's going to be important because it speaks of how her trajectory developed. Then she did her PhD in Northwestern, and by then she really started working on human behavioral ecology with always an interest and angle on economics. And she was one of the first people to bring an empirical field-based approach to the study of human behavior for asking and exploring with a lot of rigor, with a lot of attention to methods and data, evolutionary hypotheses for explaining human behavioral ecology. In 1991, she studied as a professor at UC Davis in the Department of Anthropology, and she stayed there until 2019 when she retired. She's now an emerita research professor at UC Davis. Currently, she's at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. She's also an external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute in the US. Over all these years, what Monique has done, and I don't know what that is. Phone, never so many rings. Over all these years, what Monique has done, and I think that her research, her career fits so well with so many of the themes that we have in the FINE series. She has really combined, for everything she's done, she's focused both on very, very strong theory that has driven her research, but never forgetting that the way to test theory most of the times is with data. And so she has taken a comparative approach, sometimes comparing across human societies, sometimes comparing humans with non-human animals, comparative approach to the study of demography, life history, marriage. She's done a lot of economic approach to the study of the pros and cons of establishing yourself in any kind of long-term relationship, parental investment, all topics that are very, very close, very dear to central topics in the FINE series. One of the latest accomplishments, she was admitted to the National Academy of Sciences last year, so congratulations to Monique on that. And of course, I could go on and on with the impressive number of publications she's got, and grants and postdocs and PhD students she's advised. One of the things that maybe sets her a little bit apart from some of the other speakers is that over the years, most likely because her focus has been studying humans, she has been slowly transitioning to pay more attention to cultural evolutionary models. And what I think is fascinating is that when still holding onto a very strong foot on theory, she has tried to develop applied research for human communities, always within the framework of evolutionary theory. Today, I really like the title, she's gonna be talking about polygyny, the evolution of a model, improvements in comparative evolution anthropology. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Monique. Monique, it's a pleasure having you with us, and please take it from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Eduardo, for such a kind introduction. It's so great to see you after so many years from indeed those early graduate seminars with you and Claudia. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to FINE, and it's great to see such a nice audience. So I'm going to talk about the polygyny threshold model, which is a model that I worked on, it seems like the Pleistocene now, back in the beginning of my PhD, but which I've had a lot of fun with in a couple of recent years, going back to working with new tools, new collaborators, and new data. So my more general goal here is to introduce people in the FINE series who probably don't know much about work that's been done on humans to recent developments in how anthropologists use human data to both develop and test models for human social behavior. But I'm going to start, rather embarrassingly, by presenting really Procrustean old data of my own, but it's really just to kind of set the scene and help you see how things have really changed. But before I head into the model, I'm going to provide some framing for my sort of scientific presentation by looking at sort of more contemporary political issues surrounding polygyny. And specifically, polygyny was labeled as a harmful cultural practice by the United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination against women, that's right. And as you can see from the revised text in 2013, the UN's view is that it contravenes a woman's right to equality with men. It causes serious emotional and financial consequences. There are grave ramifications of polygamy for women's human rights and the economic well-being, and those rights and economic well-being of their children. And as a result, they suggest that polygyny should be discouraged, even prohibited, and they call for its abolition. Now, this view is based on a mix of micro and macro level studies that have been produced both by anthropologists and demographers and also by economists. So anthropologists have compared the fertility of polygynous to monogamous women and found they have much lower fertility. They have higher child mortality. They have poorer health and nutritional outcomes, and also some indications of declining maternal mental health for polygynously married women. Economists have focused more on macro level issues. So they find that in polygynous societies, household productivity is lower. They focused on the abuse of women that they see in polygynous societies, and even pointed towards civil violence and to warfare. And this view has been, this narrative really has been very much kind of amplified by The Economist, who I think it was back in 2016, had an article, Why Polygamy Breeds Civil War, pointing to kind of hordes of unmarried men who are going to cause civil unrest. They liked the idea so much that they revisited it for their Christmas special in 2017 with an article on the link between polygamy and warfare. And then just a couple of weeks ago, they had another article on why nations that fail women fail, which is a good article, but also points the finger very blamingly towards polygyny as being the reason why women fail. And my view on this is that The Economist have actually been making very selective use of data This is partly because the data that they use is highly ideologically biased, in that most of the work on polygyny is done done by men and women from the West, from Christian traditions, who have a kind of knee-jerk aversion to anything which isn't monogamy, at least until recently. That these studies are deeply flawed by methodological problems around issues of causality. And also that they fail to recognize that polygynous institutions are highly variable. And just because we can identify some dysfunctional ones, it doesn't mean that you can cast the whole breeding system basically as a kind of cause of social pathology. So I'm going now to turn to, well, these issues I will sort of be coming back to sort of indirectly in the talk, but this is sort of meant to provide a kind of political framing to what I'm talking about. So here's the model, the polygyny threshold model. There are probably many people here who know it extremely well, but probably some who don't, so I should explain it clearly. This was developed back in the 1960s to explain the distribution of polygynous and monogamous mating systems among passerines. And here is a graphical presentation, and really all the presentations have been graphical until work that I'm going to present later in this talk. You can basically, the y-axis is female fitness, and the x-axis here is territory quality. And these curvilinear functions show basically the impact of male territory quality on female fitness for a singly breeding female and for a female in a polygamous union. And the way I'm going to explain it here is just first of all thinking of two males, one on a good territory and one on a bad territory. And when the first female arrives in the spring, she's obviously going to mate with male A on the good territory. So she'll get the fitness associated as a monogamous female with male A. When the second female arrives, you might imagine that she would mate with male B and get basically the monogamous fitness of male B here. But actually, if you look at this, she'd do better to become the polygynous female, second female with male A. And if you imagine this now not as just a kind of two different territories, but a distribution of territory quality with males settled across all these different territories, females are going to settle with them just according to territory quality. So you get basically an ideal free distribution of females across these different territory qualities, such that the fitness of monogamous and polygynous females will be approximately equal. Now, there's very simple predictions come out of this model, obviously, that male territory quality will correlate positively with the number of his mates and his reproductive success. Secondly, as I've already indicated, that the fitness of monogamously and polygamously mated females will be equal, or at least not differ markedly. And thirdly, this is obviously between populations, not within populations, we'll get more polygyny with greater resource inequality among males. And of course, there are also some fundamental assumptions that female choice is unconstrained, and that there aren't high costs in finding the best male. Also that female reproductive success is strongly affected by male resources, that's of course these curves, and that resources are divided equally, or at least predictably among mates, so that a settling female has some idea of what kind of breeding opportunities she will face. Now, that's the model, and it's a very simple model to think of sort of conceptually, but of course there's a lot of moving parts to it. First of all, the importance of male resources or male resource holding power to female RS. So the steepness and shape of these curves is obviously going to be important. This is something that goes back to Emlen and Oring with respect to how the distribution of females affects mating systems. Another feature is how widely spaced are these two curves. So what is the extent of interference and or cooperation amongst co-mated females? Again, a topic that is being looked at by many behavioral ecologists. A third issue is how to measure fitness. And there was actually a recent paper by Barv et al. A couple of months ago looking at acorn woodpeckers. They find that plurally breeding acorn woodpeckers do worse in terms of number of nestlings fledging because of females destroying each other's eggs. But so on a seasonal basis, there's a cost to polygyny. If you look at the lifetime reproductive success, these plural breeders actually live longer and therefore have equal fitness to monogamously mated females. So we need to consider how we're measuring fitness. And then finally, we need to think about the distribution of territory quality. And that's something, do we just have binary good and bad territories? Do we have a sort of normal distribution across here? Or do we have a highly skewed distribution with a long left or right-hand tail? And this is a question that really hasn't been looked at much with non-humans, but I'll be looking at all of these issues as I go through this talk. So, as I said, I started on this a very long time ago. When I started my PhD, I drove all over Kenya looking for populations where the assumptions of the model were met, and found a population called the KipZiggys, agropastoralists living in Western Kenya, and where men have between 0 and 12 wives. So here's a polygynous family. Actually, he has 2 wives, and then this is a daughter-in-law. Parents do make decisions for their daughters, but they very strongly are guided by their daughters' preferences. So these are girls coming out of their seclusion after their puberty ceremonies. And they will be, for the most part, marrying who they want, and their parents will support them. But of course, there are cases where this is not true. And it's also a situation where resources are divided equally among co-wives. So here, this is a kind of classic photo of a polygynous household, 3 huts, then 3 granaries inside. The livestock are divided by 3. You can sort of see the way the fields are divided here. And then the maize growing area is also divided by 3. And finally, men's land and livestock is critical to women's reproductive success. So they depend very strongly on their resources. And this is because if a woman's marriage breaks down, actually it happens very rarely, she has to go back and live at her natal family, where she's generally not welcome and doesn't get access to resources. So women's dependence in these patrilineal, patrilocal systems is very strongly dependent on male resources. So just to give you just an idea, a sort of descriptive idea of what goes on here, this is a part of my study area where it's called Arbossi, and it's where the KipZiggys actually had a battle with the Maasai in the early 1930s and settled, and then kind of attracted wives into where they were settling. So I used it to test the sort of the ideal free distribution of females. And I can't believe I'm showing this slide because it's made with letraset. Most likely in Tim Clutton-Brock's lab back in 1988 or 1989, probably sitting at the only computer we had in the lab was his secretary's word processor. So this is kind of embarrassing, but let me talk it through, because for people who haven't really thought about applying this kind of stuff to humans, it's kind of helpful. So it's based on interviews, so life history interviews I did with men and their wives about, trying to work out when they were born, when they were married, how many cows they had, how much land they had. So this is really sort of discursive discussions with these families who settled in Arbossi. And what you can see here, for example, in 1933, is that there were 5 guys living there, or at least obviously I wasn't there at that time. I'm not quite that old. This is obviously retrospective data. But there was one guy who had carved out an area of basically 300 acres he was claiming to be his. And one guy with 100 acres, and then 3 guys with a lot less. And probably not surprising, in 1933, this guy was married. That's why he gets this little triangle. The next year is 1934, right? No, 1933, this guy. So this guy now is only offering 150 acres because any incoming female would have to basically share the land and the livestock with the first wife. So a guy offering 100 acres who had arrived last year but wasn't chosen that year is chosen this year. None of these guys are successful. And then let's go on to the next year. I think it's 1934. This guy with 150 acres is now chosen. Anyhow, you can go through and do a sort of survival analysis. How long do men survive without getting married? Which is an odd way of doing a survival analysis. But you can show that guys offering the biggest breeding opportunities are the ones who are most likely to get selected. And so this is some sort of obviously just descriptive support for the ideal free distribution characterizing marriage in humans. To move on to the hypotheses, the three predictions, the first one is that wealthier males will be more polygynous. And again, another embarrassing letraset figure. I promise I will move on from this. But you can see that lifetime reproductive success for this one cohort of men, and I replicated this across all different cohorts. But for this cohort of men, you can see there's a positive association between both their acres. I also did it for livestock and their reproductive success. And as you can see, some are having 40, even 80 children. So obviously this is driven, and the analysis shows that this is driven by polygyny. And even if you cut out these extremes, the association is positive. And this is a very general finding. I'm obviously not going to go through all of the studies, but I just snipped a little bit from this table from Nettle and Pollitt's and that paper, where they were looking at the association between resource control and reproductive success. And you can see they're using the data that I presented there. You can see it's quite a high association, but it's consistently positive for almost all populations. Of course, there's many more populations now, showing that basically wealthier males have more offspring, and typically this is driven by multiple wives, polygyny where it's possible, or if not, for example, in the English sample here, by serial monogamy. So to move on to the second hypothesis, this is going to be the last of these letraset figures. I looked to see whether the monogamous and polygynous female fitness were equal across the 6 cohorts in my KipZiggys data set. And you can see that here we have them classified whether the woman is married monogamously, whether she's a first wife, a second wife, or a higher order wife. And you can see that there's effectively no fitness difference across all of these different cohorts. And I did the same thing for a number of co-wives rather than marital status. I did it for measures like how many years do you overlap with other co-wives, and found no difference. I looked at the actual wealth, so what we were calling in that earlier figure, the sort of breeding opportunity for monogamous and polygynous females, they were the same. Of course, one of the concerns is sample selection, that maybe different kinds of women go into polygynous than monogamous marriages. And I looked at this by examining age at menarche, by examining natal family wealth, so the wealth of their natal families, and also looking at their education. And none of these things co-varied with marital status, so is unlikely to be affecting any of these results, even though there is no result. This result, I would argue in the KipZiggys, although I've not been able to show it empirically, I haven't looked at to show it empirically, results from co-wife cooperation. Here are 2 wives co-wives working together making beer. And there's an interesting quote here from an early ethnographer of the KipZiggys, from Orchardson, who says that polygamy is as much appreciated by women as it is by men. When a man wishes to take a second wife, he usually consults his first wife. He certainly does so if he's wise. She then frequently selects a wife from amongst her own friends. And this is exactly what I was seeing in the 1980s and even in the 1990s when I was back working there again. So that's probably the explanation for the result here, but it's important to note that really, as in the non-human literature, the evidence for equilibrated fitness between monogamous and polygynously mated females is quite mixed. And this is a topic that that people have come back to almost every decade and analyzed to sort of review the literature. And generally what these reviews find is that in some cases, polygynous females do better in terms of fertility. In some cases, they do worse in terms of child mortality. In some cases, they do better in terms of child health and survival. In some cases, they don't. The data are really all over the place. That's what each of these reviews effectively finds. And this is probably because populations differ in the extent to which wives can have unconstrained choice in their marriages. It probably depends on the extent to which male resources can be shared. You know, are they shareable or not? It's something I'll come back to later. It also depends on the kinds of potential for cooperation or competition among co-wives. And so there are basically many different things that might account for this. So, so just before I go on to the third hypothesis, which I'm going to talk about with newer data, I want to sort of take two sort of side paths here to explore a little bit more this question of the impact of polygyny on the fate of monogamous and polygynous women. So these two sidetracks, one will be about co-wife competition and cooperation, and the second will be about the methodological challenges of identifying the consequences of polygyny. So with respect to co-wife competition and cooperation, I've always kind of been puzzled in that the places where I have worked that have been polygynous, I tend to see strong patterns of cooperation. I've already talked about the KipZiggys here. These two women, you have to help somebody else to put this heavy load onto your back. So you always have to go out with someone else, and co-wives very often do that together. Otherwise, you very commonly see cooperation over childcare. Or here in the Sukuma, for example, you see cooperation. Here are three co-wives and a number of their daughters-in-law, basically engaging in collective action to take their husband to court for abusive behavior. So there are a lot of ways in which I have observed women cooperate as co-wives. Now, this is, of course, not to say that I haven't also seen situations of competition and conflict. I've seen one co-wife burn down another co-wife's house. I've seen an attempt to poison their children and other kinds of abuses. But my point is that I think that the extent of competition and conflict has been very much sort of exaggerated in the literature because of the sort of ideological, but given that we don't have quantitative data on this, because of the ideological biases of ethnographers and economists coming from Western cultures with Christian backgrounds and sort of just expecting to see bad relations. And this is kind of odd because there's a huge literature pushing humans as cooperative breeders. So we're quite happy to think about helping each other out within families, but somehow the relationship between co-wives just seems to be unpalatable. And well, as I said, we don't have much data on this. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of a new direction that's really coming out of working with economists. That this is work here that I'm doing in collaboration with Alessandra Cassar, Christina Moya, and Bethany Gerdeman. And the data come from northern part of Sierra Leone, working with Mende and Temne men and women. This is a very polygynous area. And here we're using experimental economic games. This is a methodology that increasingly anthropologists are starting to use to examine social relationships. And what Bethany and Alessandra did was to basically characterize interactions with partners on the basis of how people play in 4 different economic games: a sharing game, a costless sharing game, an envy game, and a costless envy game. And they characterized the outcomes of gameplay as either egalitarian, resource maximizing, generous, or selfish. Now, these are kind of largely self-explanatory, but what they effectively do is follow a rubric that Ernst Fehr et al. Developed in a paper in 2008. So that you basically look at there's two options that anyone playing any game can choose. And so, for example, a maximizer would be somebody who chooses the option where the overall return to the couple, to both, is higher than the alternative. So this would be the maximizing solution, this would be the maximizing solution, and this would be. So individuals who play in that way will be classified as maximizers. Generous, again, it's kind of obvious. You're going to be, if you give more to the other person in this game than you give to yourself, you're generous. And so the yellow highlighted areas are basically coded as generous. Selfish, you can only do actually for one of the games. And again, it's obviously where you take more for yourself than others. Or each of these configurations are used in our data. So what we show here, I'm only really just going to show one result because there's an awful lot going on. And as you can see, this work is still in preparation. I think there's still more work we need to do to understand the pattern. But what you can see here is the behavioral types as characterized that men show towards their wives or that women show towards their husbands. And for both figures, the darker bar are for polygynously mated couples, and then the lighter bar is for monogamously married couples. And what you can see is that both for men and for women, polygynous couples play both for men and for women, polygynous individuals play much more maximizing than do monogamous ones. And they also tend to be more generous, although there is some overlap in these standard errors. But for men and also to some extent for women. However, there's greater egalitarianism that we see in the gameplay of monogamous men and also monogamous women. And polygynous women tend to be more selfish than do monogamous women in their play with their husband again. So although the pattern's all over the place, you can see that there certainly is some generosity and maximization going on in these polygynous families compared to monogamous ones. Other results that we have, and here I'm just going to present the ones only for polygynous households, we can see using exactly the same methodology show that co-wives are more egalitarian and less selfish with one another than they are with their husbands. So this is just looking at the polygynously mated individuals, married individuals. And these wives are showing greater egalitarianism and selfishness and less selfishness, with their co-wives than they were with their husbands. When we just look at how co-wives treat one another, they basically, whether it's a first wife playing with a second wife or a second wife playing with a first wife, they play the same way, the same degree of cooperation and egalitarianism, selfishness, generousness, whatever. So there's no effects of wife order or wife age. Now, there's clearly a lot going on in these data, and there's more that we're going to have to investigate. But the message I just want to draw out for this talk is that polygynous partnerships are not necessarily dysfunctional nor conflict-ridden. And in fact, economists who've been using these games now for a while have been finding the same kinds of patterns that the polygynous partnerships are not necessarily competitive and full of conflict. They also find that there's polygynous households are sometimes more productive than monogamous households. And actually in this recent work by Desi and also by Hidrobo, they're beginning to find greater productivity in polygynous households than monogamous households. And it's looking as if polygyny is a good household structure to buffer yourself against risk. So particularly in cases where there's climate change and people are having to basically, update their production systems and change their production systems, polygynous households are doing somewhat better than our monogamous households. These are both studies from West Africa. So The Economist, much as I like that magazine, really they're drawing stereotypes, and there's much more going on, much more interesting to look at. So the second little side path I was going to talk about before I get back to the third and final hypothesis is the methodological issues of identifying the consequences of polygyny. And here the problem is causality. And I'm going to talk you through just an example of this on the basis of some work that I've done, that I do with an organization called Data for African Development. It's called Savannahs Forever, Tanzania. And this work is done together with David Lawson and Susan James. And these data are a little bit old now, but it was part of a big survey that we did in 2010, 2011 on collecting demographic data on 56 households across northern Tanzania. And basically, if you throw all of the data together, this is a very polygynous area. If you throw all the data together, you do indeed find these deficits in polygynous households: lower child survival, poorer health outcomes, poorer food security. However, if you pay attention to the ecological fallacy, and that, of course, is the problem of drawing inferences about individual level data on the basis of characteristics of the group or statistics coming from the group, you can make some very false inferences, which really need to be corrected by doing multi-level analysis in which you basically control for the village and other features of the group where the data are being taken from. So just to walk you through this, here are the data. I'm not going to go into the methodology at all, except to say that it was obviously collected at the household level. And so we have measures, what you would imagine here if polygyny is causing problems across these different outcome variables: household food security, child height for age, and child weight for height. You would expect these parameter estimates, given that the baseline here is monogamous families, you'd expect these parameter estimates all to be negative. So that polygynous households would have lower food security, would have poorer child height and poorer child weight scores. However, I mean, without going into all the details, you can see that the data are just all over the place. And we have two different definitions of polygynous households, which I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see that there are just as many positive effects or associations of polygyny with these outcome measures as there are negative ones. They differ somewhat across the different ethnic groups. So green is Sakuma, blue, red is Maasai, and orange is Rangi. But generally, well, if anything, they're more positive associations, and none of the negative ones are fail to overlap zero, so are probably not very, very robust. And this is based on a lot of households from the area. We're selecting all the households where there was one or more child under 5 years of age. So what's going on here? Well, it's really very simple to demonstrate with this figure. So here you can see all of our 56 villages arrayed according to the prevalence of polygyny in the area. And here you can see these same parameter estimates, here just shown for height for age. Again, you'd expect them all to be negative if the effects truly were negative of polygyny. But what you can see is that most of the negative effects come from these Maasai villages. And what you can't see here, but I have to tell you, is they come from the northern part of the study area, the part bordering Kenya, which is very dry. And perhaps more importantly, has very poor infrastructure in terms of health, in terms of water development, and in terms of education. So the kind of message here is that the problem's not polygyny per se, but rather characteristics of the area, both ecological and institutional, that are in the areas where polygyny is most likely to persist. And so, yet again, coming back to that Economist framing I showed earlier, this suggests that an awful lot of the kinds of correlational evidence that they support is really marred by this problem of the ecological fallacy. So I'm going to now come to the last hypothesis, and that is that just to summarize where we are, I showed that we have, I sort of demonstrated an ideal free distribution with the KipZiggys. Nobody else has done that, so I can't really generalize that, but that was just to introduce you to sort of how we think about this kind of stuff. The first hypothesis was positively supported with the KipZiggys, and actually is positively supported with just numerous studies. I didn't bother to review them all. The evidence that we have for equilibrating fitness of polygynous and monogamously mated individuals was supported with the KipZiggys, but I pointed out that there's lots of variation across different sites and different studies, but I have sort of taken a sidetrack to point out that I really think that the extent of cooperation among co-wives has not been seriously investigated, or the potential for cooperation. And I also think that many of these studies are deeply marred by failing to think through carefully causal models. And if anywhere there's an area in the social science that we need to use DAGs, it will be here. So with that kind of brief review, I'm now going to go on to this last hypothesis, which is the idea that there should be more polygyny in societies or populations with greater wealth inequality. And here, basically, everything goes to pieces. There's absolutely no evidence. In fact, social scientists have known for a long time that you tend to get more monogamy in more complex societies and more inegalitarian societies. So let's just think of it here, the moment using production systems, just because we have data on this, but it makes the point that here, if you think of foraging societies, hunter-gatherers, horticultural societies, so that's societies that cultivate, but not with a plow, just with a handheld hoe, pastoralist societies who herd livestock, and then agricultural societies, so people who plow with, who cultivate with plows. You can see that the mean percent of females married polygynously is much lower for the agricultural societies. Here we're looking at, this is using standard cross-cultural sample data, and I'm going to talk about problems with this later, but just for the moment, bear with me. Here we're talking about rules for monogamy and polygyny, and again, you can see that agricultural societies are much more likely to have monogamy either prescribed by rule or at least preferred by rule. And here are some data on the same production systems looking at actual inequality. So this is based on individual level data, and these are Gini measures of rival wealth. I'm going to define rival wealth in a moment, but it's really just material stuff. And you can see that the agricultural populations have much higher inequality than the other populations. So there's just no indication, at least from this, that the third hypothesis, that we'll get more polygyny in more unequal populations derived from the polygyny threshold model, is supported. And we call this the polygyny paradox. Why does polygyny disappear when you get a really unequal society? And in the last work that I'm going to talk about now, in the last 15 minutes or so, this is work trying to solve the polygyny paradox. It's done in collaboration with Sam Bowles, Cody Ross, and Xiangyong Oh. What we did was basically use individual level data on males' economic resources and their marital histories and their reproductive success to basically calculate how polygynous they should be, and then explore whether they are, and if not, why not. So somewhat more, just filling this out a bit more, what we did is we rebuilt the polygyny threshold model as a mutual mate choice model, which is of course appropriate in a species with biparental care, where you expect both men and women to be pretty choosy. And then we used this model to predict the conditions that favor monogamy or polygyny, and then develop certain parameters to kind of explain this, and then explore these parameters in our 29 populations. So the mutual mate choice model is basically, it's very straightforward. It's just the same logic of the polygyny threshold again, but now in algebra. So a man's fitness is a function of the number of his wives and two different kinds of wealth. We talk about rival wealth, with M, that really stands for material, and non-rival, G, we sort of think of it as genes, and then the costs of acquiring a wife. So just to, rival wealth is, of course, this stuff. If I have a cow, my co-wife doesn't, right? It's either mine or it's hers. And whereas non-rival wealth is stuff that both of us share. So, right, quintessentially, of course, it's male genetic quality, but it may also be his skills. It may be his social capital, his reputation, the number of people he can bring to a beer drinking festival, as you see here. It's something that we can all benefit from that's not basically depreciable. It's, I know, the term often used in animal behavior, but we use rival and non-rival. And actually, for the work that I'm going to talk about now, we're going to hold non-rival constant. And we have to do that basically because there just isn't good enough comparative data across the 29 populations. But we are exploring G more in models if people want to ask about that. So the model is really simple here. A man's fitness is a function of the number of his wives, which is therefore, obviously, part of the average fitness of each wife. And so the average fitness of each wife is a function of his, this is the non-rival wealth, and then the rival wealth, which of course is going to be devalued by the number of his wives, and C, which is the cost of acquiring a wife. So it's just the same basic intuition I showed in that very first model. And we have two weighting parameters that are kind of important to explore this empirically. Mu is basically, it's an elasticity. So it's the percentage increase in male fitness associated with a 1% increase in male rival wealth per wife, which is a long way of saying how important are male resources to female fitness. That was something I picked out again from that very first model. And then gamma is exactly the same elasticity, but for non-rival wealth. So how important is a man's non-rival wealth to his fitness, a woman's fitness, which then of course feeds into his fitness. So this is pretty much standard polygyny threshold. There is one further parameter that we kind of stumbled upon from in our empirical work and then fed it back into the model. And this is kind of an interesting development of working, both with a model and with an empirical data set and using both to inform each other. But we call it delta, which is the percent increase in male fitness associated with a 1% increase in wives holding constant rival wealth per wife. Now that's hard to get your head around. So let me explain how I really think about it. It's the cost of polygyny beyond the having to share the guy's money or the guy's rival wealth, whatever it is. So I like to think of it as kind of the cost to him of not being able to read every night a book to the children of each of his wives. So we could really sort of think of this as some kind of time cost. And the way it works is when delta is 1, basically a man is only worth his money. And so women there's no cost to sharing him once you've calculated the cost of having to share his money or his rival wealth. As delta gets lower, there's an increasing time cost in having to share this guy. But I'll come back to what delta means at the very end, but that's the best way to think about it. And then to sort of ease the calculations here, we actually just, rather than having the whole distribution of wealth, we thought about, we used the fraction of rich males, so that and we call that theta, and you'll see that that's what I'm going to use moving on from now. So is there a large number of very rich males or a small number of very rich males? That gets picked up by theta. And we're assuming that women own no wealth and also that they're all the same. And that is obviously a problem that we need to come back to. So the model results basically, and here's the sort of the key intuition, and that is that the model basically revealed the conditions that favor monogamy emerging even in a really unequal society, so that favor monogamy occurring in an unequal society and therefore solving the polygyny paradox. So the two features, the two conditions that we found, the first is diminishing returns to adding wives arising from causes other than shared wealth. So this low delta. So key is when there's a big time cost to, or that's what we're calling it, a time cost, this idea of having to read to the kids of each wife. When that cost is high, it's not surprising, monogamy becomes more common as the adaptive solution. And secondly, we also found that monogamy was favored when you have a very small class of exceptionally wealthy men. So a low theta, this low fraction of very wealthy men. The way to sort of think this through is that there's a situation with very few extremely wealthy men who basically can't marry enough wives to use up all their wealth. Or if they start doing that, this delta cost, this time cost is going to kick in. So that's the main sort of finding of the model. I'm going to, for people who can stand looking at Lorenz curves, I'm just going to sort of explain the logic underlying this a little bit more. But if you don't follow me entirely, don't worry, because these are the main points I'm trying to make here. That's a dog. So yes, these are Lorenz curves. And so a Lorenz curve, basically a flat curve like this indicates that wealth is equally divided between everybody. I'm just going to close the door because that's a very noisy dog. Hey, Spotty. Sorry about that. So there are two curves here. They're both got the same Gini. So these two populations, simulated populations, have the same inequality. But if you look at the X curve, there's a small number of people, basically 10% of the population own 25% of the wealth. Whereas in the Y population, the blue curve, you have a small, very poor class, and then everybody else owns, wealth is relatively equally distributed. And so you have different fractions of wealthy people, a much smaller fraction in the X curve than in the Y. And if you run a population like this through our model, you basically find you get lower levels of polygyny in X in this population, in this population, the red one, than you do in the blue one, despite the same Gini. Okay, so the Gini is the same, but because of the different pattern of the distribution, particularly this very small class of exceptionally wealthy people, basically mutes the expression of polygyny. To make this more realistic, think of this red curve here.
We lost her. Okay, let's give her a few seconds.
Wealth is quite equally distributed.
We lost you, Monique, if you can repeat the last 5-10 seconds. We lost you for a few seconds.
Oh yes, internet connection is unstable.
Just 10 seconds or so, not more than that.
Okay, so I'm going to move on from this distribution where we hold the Gini the same, but which showed that the blue Y line actually predicts higher polygyny than the red X line. In this one, we changed things, we allowed the Gini to be different, to be more realistic. So effectively, the X line here, you can think of as an agricultural population. 10% of the population owns 70% of the wealth. These are agricultural landowning barons, and the rest of the wealth is relatively equally held. Whereas in the blue one, you find that the wealth amongst the wealthier sector of the population is more equally held. So that's more typical of a hypothetical horticultural, pastoralist, or hunter-gatherer population. And again, here, when we run the data, the simulated data through a model, we find lower levels of polygyny in X, in the agriculturalists, than we do in Y, the horticulturalists and hunter-gatherers, despite there being a higher Gini in the agricultural population. So effectively, our model is solving the polygyny paradox. But the key, the key message to take away from this is it's not the extent of inequality, the genie, that's so important, but it's structure that matters in shaping polygyny, or at least in causing either polygyny or monogamy. So what does this all mean for the real world? We built a cross-cultural data set of 29 different populations. And this is working with a whole team of anthropologists who have data on these different populations, often places where they've worked for many, many years. And they provided us data on male reproductive success, that's of course age adjusted. They provided us with data on polygyny, also age adjusted. And then they worked to develop locally relevant measures of rival wealth, so stuff that can't be easily shared, like livestock, land, money, household goods. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight here that this is really a very different way of doing comparative anthropology from most of the way that it's been done with sort of comparative, with standardized data sets in the past. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk to highlight the significance of this. But the point here is simply that people measure the most appropriate measures, the most appropriate items for their particular populations. So the empirical results, what we're looking here is to see if there's any evidence of the two different kind of conditions that we identified as being critical for solving the polygyny paradox. And the first to remember was that delta is low, and delta is kind of this odd thing, it's reversed. That means that there's big time costs to polygyny. So, or evidence of diminishing returns to adding wives for reasons other than the sharing of the rival wealth. And I'm just glossing it as time costs, although it could be other things. And you can see it, so these are the deltas that are calculated from our empirical data. And you can see that generally they are well below 1, indicating there's serious time costs, particularly in the agricultural populations, which is just what you'd expect, given that that's where we're finding most monogamy. I think that the quite high levels, that there don't appear to be many time costs here, is probably because of the sort of counteracting effects of co-wife cooperation. Because remember, these are calculated empirically from the data, so there may be other things going on as well. And the relatively high deltas here, again, indicating not much time cost, maybe because these two hunter-gatherer populations, they have polygyny, but they also have serial monogamy and polygyny. So some of the wives overlap and some don't. Of course, under those circumstances, you'd have less evidence of time costs. So our first condition appears to have some empirical support from our 29 data sets. And then what about our second one? That is that the theta. Remember that if you have a very small, wealthy class, you're more likely to have monogamy because of basically the problems of crossing the polygyny threshold. And here again, this is from our empirical data. You can see that we are for agricultural populations generally have a much smaller fraction of very wealthy males than do other populations. And of course, this is a tiny sample, but getting individual level data can be quite difficult. And unfortunately, we only have it for 4. But we do make reference here to data from Fortunato and Bowles, where they are using archaeological data from both late Neolithic and also sort of classic early states to calculate inequality. They use things like grave goods or size of houses or size of storage units from the archaeological record. And we use those to calculate thetas in the same way that we did with our contemporary data. And we actually find that their values are pretty similar to the ones that we have in our contemporary data. So we suggest that we suspect that this is a pretty general phenomenon. So I'm coming to the end here. We've identified and confirmed empirically the two conditions that lead to solving the polygyny paradox. Remember, the polygyny paradox was the failure to support the third hypothesis of the polygyny threshold model. these two conditions are basically jointly sufficient to generate a transition to more frequent monogamy in stratified populations. So these are the conditions that allow us to get monogamy even in highly unequal populations. And the two conditions are highly skewed inequality, so that was the very small theta, and then rival qualities of male. There's important rival qualities of males that appear to be important for women that go beyond just the having to divide their material wealth. So by way of summary, really, I'm just going to highlight some aspects of this study and kind of questions that come out of it. First of all, probably most sort of importantly and most puzzlingly, what is delta? Delta, remember, I noted that it really sort of turned up from the empirical data that we were, our empirical analysis, that we were finding these big costs that were not basically soaked up with the mu term, the term which was the effective cost of sharing rival wealth. And so we don't have actual data from these populations, these 29 populations, and to test what it is. And besides, it's likely to be different things in different populations. So this raises huge questions for comparative work, how you start to operationalize sort of models when they get complicated like this. But the most likely is some competition over paternal time investment, either in children, or maybe the time he has to spend in guarding his wives. It's sort of, you know, basically from bachelor herds, you could think of sort of Impala or something like that. And so, you know, this is clearly something that could be, these are topics that have been examined before by anthropologists, and actually economists are starting to look into as well. But this is clearly something we need to pursue further with systematic comparative data. Another thing is that it may be nothing to do with time investment. It may simply be due to something like sexually transmitted diseases. We know both from theoretical work and from empirical work that sexually transmitted diseases are more common in polygynous populations than monogamous populations. So the deficit that we pick up with this delta could be nothing to do with time. It could be something to do with lower fertility or lower fecundity. And it may be something to do with co-wife conflict, which, as I've noted before, you know, demographers have been writing about since, you know, basically the middle of the last century. And again, we don't have good measures of that in our 29 populations, so it's something to pursue further. And then there may be measurement issues, which I'm not going to go into now, but they may well be issues that you'd like to discuss further in the Q&A at the end of the talk. What's happened in the past? What did happen in the past? I put that up because I just want to sort of emphasize that I really, you know, in writing this paper, we did not want to use it as a kind of a sort of evolutionary scenario and storytelling. This is, you know, necessarily the origins of monogamy. Even though I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, I'm often quite averse to papers which just kind of take one result and then try and sort of tell a whole evolutionary scenario. You know, so often these things are ends in one, although of course that's not the case here. But my interest, and certainly the interest of my collaborators on this, is to use contemporary dynamics to identify potential evolutionary routes. So not to kind of say this is necessarily how monogamy started, but under these conditions, it would be more likely for monogamy to emerge, even in a highly inegalitarian society. And maybe, you know, I'm putting in red things here that sort of you might want to follow up in questions, or we can follow up in the slots that I have with students later. But this is a very different way of hypothesis testing, a very different way of thinking about the human past. And you might want to compare it to the kinds of cultural phylogenetic studies that are coming out a lot these days from cultural evolutionists and evolutionary anthropologists. I just wanted to highlight also that I really think that this kind of work is a great improvement on the comparative method in anthropology. I emphasized, and will again, that our data are based on individual level data and collected by ethnographers who've worked in these communities for a long time. And what we're doing is comparing functions. So we're comparing things like, the effect of wealth on reproductive success, or things like you could measure the effect of the size of a bride wealth on the probability that a marriage stays together. So we're looking really more at the internal dynamics of social systems and how they can or cannot be predicted by evolutionary models, rather than just comparing across societies cross-cultural codings like monogamous, polygynous, or patrilineal, matrilineal. And although, of course, it's much more time intensive and analytically intensive, I think that this is a much more exciting way of doing comparative research. And I don't know, I may well be wrong here, be interested in your views, but I don't see this kind of comparing the internal sort of workings of systems across different species or even across different populations. I don't see this so much in the non-human literature, but I may be wrong about that. I'm obviously not entirely up to date. A third point to stress is that we have a sort of a network of ethnographers who work together on this kind of research, and this is really exciting because you can think through much more carefully about how to measure things, how to make work comparable. Here, well, really, it's moving into this point here. We can sort of work on methodological standardization and increasingly now, although some of the work that I've done has been retrospective, so people who collected data for other reasons then contribute their data to these kinds of meta-analyses. But increasingly now, we're using prospective design. So we all meet together before and we actually design exactly our data collecting protocols before we go to the field. And so there's obvious pros and cons of this different way of doing comparative work. I'd be interested in your views on that as well. And finally, I want to highlight, and Eduardo mentioned at the very beginning that I sort of, was trained as a human behavioral ecologist, but I am sort of becoming increasingly interested in cultural evolutionary models. This work for me sort of crystallizes quite clearly the distinction between those two approaches. And I just want to emphasize that all our work was based on the assumptions of rational individual fitness calculations that men and women are making over the various costs and benefits of entering into monogamous versus polygynous marriages. And that's the polygyny threshold model yet again. And so when we find monogamy emerging, this is really the endogenous origins of monogamy. We're not having to make recourse to make sort of norms, say, well, a norm emerges from monogamy and that's why everybody marries monogamously. Or we're not having to make recourse to some sort of cultural group selection models. Not that I'm averse to cultural group selection models, but we actually don't need it. We found monogamy to emerge endogenously as a result of the adaptive fitness calculations of individuals. And so norms might follow, if you have a rich class of farmers who are marrying monogamously, it's quite likely there's all kinds of learning biases why the trait for monogamy might spread and become established as a norm. But that's where our work differs from, say, Joe Henrik et al.'s paper on the origins of monogamy, where they basically put it down to cultural group selection. But in our case, the norms kind of follow the individual responses. And so this raises all kinds of questions that we're still grappling with. But again, I'd be interested in your ideas on the relationship between rules and institutions and individual fitness. And with that, I'll end up and just say thanks to so many people who answered my endless questions in different parts of East Africa, to incredible collaborators, to generous funding organizations, and to you, the listeners. Thanks very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Monique, for a very, very interesting presentation. I very quickly, before we move on to the questions and answers, I thought it would be a good idea to share with you, just remind you that next week we're taking a 180-degree turn, and we will be hearing about polyandry and sex role reversals from Wolfgang Goleman. So competing females and caring males. So this is just in case you need to go, that you know what's coming up next week. Having said that, I'll stop sharing. And like I said early on, what we do now is we engage in an exciting round of questions and answers. I'm sure there will be many, so please, if you have a question for Monique, I suggest that you just type a question mark like Michael Taborgi has just done to show us the way. So Michael, please, your question to Monique.
Okay, Michael Taborski from University of Bern. Thank you very much. This was very interesting, especially for someone who knows so little about human mating patterns. What I would be interested in is, I mean, as far as I understood, you were talking about social mating systems, and I would be interested in the relationship of genetic or sexual mating patterns with social mating systems in humans. Is there any kind of regular relationship between social mating systems and genetic mating patterns?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm sorry I didn't make reference to that. I should have. It's a very, very general question. I can't answer for all populations, as you can well imagine. Just as a normal citizen of this world, the association between marriage and, well, with paternity certainty is extremely variable across populations. People have done studies on this. And the general estimate is about, for at least for Western populations, is about 8 to 11% of kids are born outside of the recognized union. But even those data are quite old now, so I don't know what the update is on that. As an anthropologist, we really accept that even marriage is a very variable institution. So for the particular population that I was talking about, the KipZiggys, of course, I don't have data on it, but there's every reason to believe that paternity is very high because women, if they are found having relationships with other men, are in huge trouble. They get divorced immediately. They get sent home to their natal family. The bride wealth, which is the payment that a man has to pay to his wife, is returned. So the natal family have to give up all these cows they had. And they get this girl back who might be pregnant, but who doesn't have rights to his resources any longer, and who are basically competitors now with her brothers. So, you know, I obviously talked to KipZiggys women about this, and they just said, you know, it's not worth it. Or if you're going to do this, you've got to be really, really, really careful. But that is an N of one. And so your question is much bigger and much more interesting. What is the relationship between marriage and paternity certainty? And all I can really say is that it's very, very variable. I work in a population, or I was working until 2016, in a population in Western Tanzania that actually Claudia Kasper, who of course was a student with you, worked on with me, where we found that marriage was, well, we know that marriage is very unstable, and really marriages are defined by who you have your babies with. And if you have a baby with somebody else and both he and she agree, you start cooking together. And the word for marriage is kujipikia, which is basically to cook together, which means to, both feed it, cook together and to sleep together. So yeah, a really good question. And it would be wonderful to have a more systematic analysis of that one could give in answer to your question. I don't have it, but I don't think it's a problem for my particular KipZiggys study.
No, certainly not. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The next question comes from Clara Jones. Clara?
Hi, I've always loved your work, and this is no exception.
Clara, I'm Clara and everyone, please, if you can remember to introduce yourself and indicate where you are so that we continue building our fine community.
I'm sorry?
No, if you can say where you are, introduce yourself, yeah. In case
well, I'm retired and I study mammal social evolution. Again, I think your work is just fascinating. especially the hypothetico-deductive nature of it. I have a comment first and then a quick question. The comment is that it has frequently been stated in the literature that monogamy is derived rather than ancestral in mammals anyway. And your data show, your study shows monogamy to be derived in these particular cases. So from polygyny. So I think that is worth pointing out. My question is that since cooperation can be imposed rather than self-selected, do you have any evidence that the cooperation is a result of, for example, coercion, manipulation, policing, something like that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Clara. Those are good points to raise. The issue of monogamy being derived, this touches on sort of, what the original state is for humans or human ancestors, and it's quite hotly debated. But in some respects, I think most people would agree, probably mild polygyny, at least on the basis of sexual dimorphism, that is kind of what characterizes our species. But as I actually said in the talk, I'm really uncomfortable about making these kinds of claims about the past, particularly for traits that are so flexible and malleable, like monogamy and polygyny. You can imagine this, actually the population that I worked in into 2016 had been largely monogamous apart from the chiefs. And now that a road is going through the area and there's new wealth, you're actually getting polygyny. So these mating systems in humans are highly facultative, highly dependent on resource distributions. So I'm quite uncomfortable using those terms, but your general point is right, and it probably is worth pointing out. So thank you. The question about imposed cooperation, yes, I mean, if there are two ways you can answer it. I mean, one is that women find themselves making adaptive choices about whether they want to marry monogamously or polygamously. They end up in these polygynous unions because of the male distribution of wealth. They then, I guess, have the choice whether to get on with their co-wives or not. And as I indicated, there are cases where they sometimes don't. I don't know if that's coercion, but I mean, the environment, the fact that there is an ecology that allows men to accumulate resources in an unequal way leads women into this situation where they end up being married polygynously. Is that coercion? I don't know. We get into philosophical issues there, so I wouldn't really go there. But the other way to answer it is more in terms of norms and are there norms for how co-wives should behave? And there are. It's very much viewed that co-wives should work together and respect each other and help each other, etc. Now, how much of that is a male ideology, patriarchal ideology enforced on women because it's to their advantage that women cooperate? It's again it's just a difficult issue how you solve that. I tend to, given that I've seen women cooperate and not cooperate in polygynous marriages, and given also, like I was saying, the KipZiggys, that women do often choose the woman with whom they want to have as a mate, a co-mate or a co-wife. I think that calling it coercion is not necessarily appropriate. But I know, of course, there are polygynous systems across the world where coercion and force can occur. So again, it's going to be variable, and we need to understand the conditions why it's variable.
Thank you.
Next question is from Carsten Schrading.
Yes, hello, Carsten Schrading from the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, studying mammalian social systems. Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. It's always nice to see these concepts applied so broadly. My main question is, why did you or your co-workers choose the KipZiggys as a study population? How do you think how representative they are for polygynous humans? And also for the larger sample you later showed, it all seems to be based in Central Africa and Central South America. How representative do you think they are for polygynous human societies?
Yeah, good points. I don't see anybody as representative of humans. I think we study populations to understand variability. And so I specifically chose the KipZiggys kind of like, as I said, because they were appropriate for testing the particular model. You know, when you're doing a PhD, you want to kind of make things as tight as possible. So they were a good group for testing that model. How representative they are, well, I just, no one's representative of humans generally, but they are very representative of African agropastoralist populations. I've done a lot of comparative work with pastoralists. I'm actually working with different pastoralists now in northern Kenya, and I've worked with different ones in northern Tanzania. There are many, many similarities in these kinds of male resource holding mating systems where males control resources and then females kind of map onto the resources. So I think it's quite general, but obviously, you know, like this population I've worked with in Western Tanzania is completely different. Males don't control very much at all. Women in many ways are more powerful, and the marriage system is completely different. But your second point, it raises actually a really interesting point about these comparative studies, and you're spot on. We pin onto those maps sites where we have ethnographers. Normally they're evolutionary anthropologists because they're the only people who really collect systematic comparative data, systematic quantitative data. They're the only people who are really interested to work with us. And so it's highly, I don't know if it's biased, but it's not selected to be representative at all. And actually, we had a paper last year in Prop B on the sort of both the sort of scientific value and the ethics of these kinds of massive comparative studies that are coming out these days. And that is one of the points we make, that people tend to read these comparative studies and then sort of talk about them as if this is humans. And often the inferences are drawn from populations that might be very atypical. You know, if you want to test a hypothesis, you've got to choose the appropriate sample. And very rarely can we do that. We're limited by the data available, which is limited in two ways. One, that you've got to have society, if you're interested in sort of how traditional populations work, you've got to have societies that haven't been too much affected by the nation state. And secondly, you've got to have a friendly anthropologist working there. So yeah, really good points and serious things that need to be taken into consideration when people report their results from comparative studies.
Thank you.
Okay. Maren Hoek, your question next.
Hello, my name is Maren Hoek. I'm at the University of Derby in the UK and collaborating with Eduardo, if I'm not working on cats. And I have, so first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Some of that was a little bit going over my head today because I taught all morning. I have two questions, sort of related. So first of all, how much do your data come from qualitative self-assessments by the people that you interview? Because there are obviously some data on human. So just today, by a coincidence, I talked about the social sexuality index, where there is a study that essentially comes to the conclusion that males have more mates on average than females, which obviously can't be the case if you have an equal sex ratio. And obviously these biased data come probably from people not necessarily telling the truth. And I don't know how much your data set could be influenced by that or not. And the second question is, in some other models that have been done previously for animal models, sometimes the point of view of other individuals in the population are ignored. And in this case, it would be, how important is it to perhaps include what's happening with the non-married males? So if you have lots of polygynous males, then you must have also lots of males that have no wives at all. And how do they influence the whole thing?
Yeah, thanks very much. And sorry about your morning teaching. It doesn't sound fun. Yeah, the truth, right, relying on reported data, which is what we largely do as demographers or anthropological demographers. Although, well, we largely do it, yes. There are, we have many techniques for trying to assess the reliability of our data. And, you know, these are things you kind of teach your graduate students how to, you know, sort of reverse engineer the way you ask questions, obviously triangulate from different people. If you have the luxury of a longitudinal study, you can go back and ask the same questions next year and, you know, try to work out how reliable it is. Generally, demographic data are, I think, quite easy to get good measures on. I mean, that mortality can be a problem. I've almost threw a whole data set away because I was so convinced the mortality data was bad because people were having such trouble answering. And I can understand why. If you've lost 4 or 5 kids, you know, this person comes in and keeps asking you about them and trying to get dates and whatever. But actually, then when the next year I went back and I kind of tried to ask the same questions, I got almost, I mean, I was so glad I hadn't thrown the data away because I got almost the same answers and could see that there was reliability. It's a matter of, it's how you collect the data. Do you speak the language? Do you do it yourself? Do you send out, you know, enumerators? Often the data that I will get as an anthropologist speaking the language will be very different from what, you know, the census that comes in every 10 years, say in Tanzania, they get very different measures. So, I mean, that's not a good answer because I'm just saying trust us. But I think there's some measures that we can be trusted on. And that is like when we put together that group of 29, and actually now we have a group of 45 on a network study that we're doing out of the Santa Fe Institute. You're quite selective about your anthropologists as well. You know, it's not just your sample. There's some people who you just get a sense that they're very careful with their methodology, that they have a commitment to their study site. They're often doing a lot of applied work there as well. You build up trust, and you know, so it's not a great answer, but that's the danger of reported data, and so that's how I tackle your questions about the truth. Your question about non-married men is really good, and they're very hard to interview, particularly as a female anthropologist. When I was young doing my PhD, but actually. This goes back to the kind of Economist story again. They talk about these kinds of hordes of unmarried men going around causing civil war. And there are problems. I mean, in most of these groups that I have worked with, and in fact, most of the polygynous systems, their marriage is just different. Women marry at 15 or 14, 15, 16, 17, whereas men aren't expected to marry until they're 25 or 30 because they're accumulating their herds and their land and whatever. So the sex ratio is not as of basically, you know, available males and females, culturally construed available males and females is not as biased as you would think. And this is particularly true in a growing population. Of course, most of Africa are a growing population. So you've got much larger youth cohorts and you have elder cohorts. So all of these young girls are coming up all the time. So I have not, in none of the places that I've worked, have I seen the kinds of tensions that the Economist was pointing to. But you are right that it would be useful, and I haven't really done it, to explore more the views of young men. You know what, I haven't done it because the places where I work, they're just really busy going out raiding for livestock or trying to get access to land. I mean, they're definitely having relationships with unmarried, very young girls. We know that's going on. So it's not like they're not having any sex, but they're just not getting any marriage.
I'm coming up next, but I prefer to check first. Karsten, is it a question we have from YouTube, or do we have any of our students who are interested in asking questions? If not, we can take those first. No? Okay, then I have so many questions, but I'll start with one for which I imagine there's no clear answer, but I very much look forward to hear from you. You call yourself an ethnographer. We've been talking about natural historians, right? That's what we call, but it's delightful to hear your attention and your interest in really focusing on the individual data. I haven't gone back to the literature on polyamory and the psychology of it in US societies, but my recollection from reading Bill Jankowiak's work, for example, from Utah, etc., was that his research had shown that even in polygynous societies, there was always this kind of bond and particular relationship with one of the wives that was qualitatively different from the relationship with the others. And I was just curious, I mean, what have you learned over the years regarding the relationship of the single husband with different wives? I mean, are the bonds, are the relationships, the attachment with all of them of different quality?
Yeah. I know his work, and I have to say, I'm not sure that his conclusions are as generalizable as he thinks. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in a sense, I addressed that. Well, I didn't make it clear, but in the stuff with Alessandra Casar, the work in West Africa was with the Temne and the Mende, and they are populations that classically feature in the 1950s, 60s, 70s from French demographers showing major fitness deficits to polygyny and child mortality, that there's lower fertility, that more kids die, whatever. That's really where that literature came from. And also, literature very much emphasizes co-wife effects, wife order effects. So first wives, senior wives often can boss around junior wives. They can sort of, whether they're allowed access to the husband or the husband is allowed access to them is very much dictated by the older wives. And then there's sort of inside that literature, again, from these French ethnographers and demographers, stories about, the husbands really like the youngest wife best, which is kind of probably not surprising. So there is, there's definitely Jankowiak, or whatever his name is, I've forgotten, sorry, very much kind of builds on that. And the fact that in that work with Alessandra, we found just no co-wife order effects at all was really strange, because that's from just heartland Temne Mende, where that work comes from. So I'm a little nervous about some of these generalizations that are being made about, even West African polygynous populations. But more directly to your question and the generality of co-wife relations. Of course, you're right. And I did say that at one point, that polygyny is a very different, very varying institution, and clearly there's populations in the Middle East where they're highly ranked co-wife relationships, where young wives are sort of desperately trying to run away all the time. So one has to be careful in making these arguments, so you're not generalizing about polygyny just as a kind of unitary force, that, a unitary feature, that it's never associated with problems. But the point really of my work is to show that it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with problems.
Thank you. Karsten, you're next.
Yes, thank you for having the option for a second question. It refers to one of the slides here at the very end about the association between the production system and the frequency of rich males. I assume the higher the frequency of rich males, the larger the inequality. So for me, it's surprising to see that the highest inequality you find in foragers, followed by horticulturalists. Normally people kind of assume in foragers, it's a very egalitarian society, but this graph indicates there's a lot of differences and also with the horticulturalists. So is this related to more the system, whether they have warriors and warfare, or how is that explained?
I don't have the graph in front of me, but you're talking about the Gini coefficients in rival wealth. Oh, thank you. Should be able to remember my own graph, shouldn't I? Oh, that one. Oh, yeah, right. I thought you were talking about the, yes. So that is that's the frequency of wealthy, the class of wealth, and it's based on, these foraging populations where there are just where some people, they were as you indicated, were tending to be good hunters, were classed as good hunters, and who brought in a lot more game than the other guys. So it's a little bit confusing because it's somewhat more, as I said, we measure wealth differently in different populations. And some of these wealth measures for the foraging populations are much more transitory. I mean, things like they can be the weight of the man, it can be the amount of game that he's bringing in, it can be amount of tools that he has, or the amount of boats that he has if he's a fisherman. And these are in many ways more transitory than livestock or fields, which are really what get picked up by the pastoralists and the horticulturalists. But yeah, you're right to point that out. It is, I didn't give any explanation for that. But more generally, I mean, that's from those data. More generally, we have a paper in 2009 where we look at inequality, look at Gini coefficients across the different production systems and in terms of material wealth, and we have a larger sample there. And basically, the Gini coefficients of material wealth for horticultural and hunter-gatherer populations are considerably lower than they are for pastoralist and agropastoral populations.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any questions coming from our colleagues in YouTube? Adriana, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks, Monique, for such a great talk. I'm Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. Well, my question, it's related to how flexible these mating systems are in humans. You mentioned that in the population you study, they shift from polygynous to monogamy. And I was curious about the drivers of this change or this shift. That was the first one. And then the second one, I think it was sort of by the end of your presentation, you were talking about the two conditions that help or allows the transition to monogamy. And one of them, you mentioned that was not just the quality of the rival male, but also it goes beyond material wealth. So I was curious about what other traits are females looking for in males, and what helps the system to transition to polygamy, to monogamy.
Right. So the first question, the drivers of changing mating systems, largely, I think it's economics. And that's kind of what this model was about, that the amount of inequality, I mean, in the polygyny threshold model, the amount of inequality, even if you think in terms of nest sites or something like that, where you have more variation in nest site quality, you're going to have you're more likely to have polygyny. If everybody has the same nest site quality, you're more likely to have monogamy, because you don't basically get that, meet the polygyny threshold. So I have a very so that's the kind of resource-based explanation that is at the heart of the polygyny threshold model. And I'm probably one of the more materialist anthropologists, in that I tend to think of distribution of resources, or the extent to which either sex can monopolize resources as a key driver of mating systems. So in answer to your question, I think polygyny is driven, the more inequality you have, and I didn't actually point this, or maybe I didn't show that slide, you do actually get more polygyny in, polygyny is associated with inequality in foragers and horticultural and agricultural populations. It's only in these agrarian populations where you get really, really high inequality that you get this switch to monogamy. Okay, that's kind of the polygyny paradox. So I kind of stick with the idea that resources are driving it, and even in the switch to monogamy, it's being driven by resources. Basically these are resources that, you know, one guy has so many, but he's got so much resources, he can't marry enough wives to use up all those resources. And so, you know, now his time, the way I explained it with that delta, is that it's his time is something that they're competing over, and that's why they're not marrying him polygynously. So that's your driver's question. And I mean, just to add on to that, the Pimbwe, who are a Bantu group in near Lake Tanganyika, who I worked with for about almost 20 years. I've stopped that study site now. But what we found there was it's basically a monogamous population, but the chiefs used to marry polygamously. Now, the chiefs have sort of been displaced by the British, colonial and then the sort of post-colonial changes. The chiefs aren't really very effective any longer, certainly not wealthy enough to marry polygynously. But now that a new road has been built down into the valley, and there's suddenly kind of opportunities for getting wealthy, either by working on the road crews or starting to market, selling your crops out of the area, we're starting to see an increase in polygyny that had not been present amongst the commoners, the non-chiefs in the population in the past. So I really think, I take a very materialist view here, and that it's changes in distributions of resources, and which of course depends on the nature of the resources. In the past, Pimbwe just had cassava fields, and so there wasn't much benefit in accumulating a lot of them because they really depend on women's labor anyhow to be productive. So men couldn't control anything that was useful to them. So that's my answer to your drivers. To what women are choosing on, that's a good question that I'm not, again, I'm using my very materialistic approach, which really comes from this model, which is, even the delta, which is we find obviously that women are choosing on the basis of resources, but then are there other things? I did find, for example, in that ideal free distribution model that I put at the very beginning, men were being chosen primarily on the resources that they were offering. But if there were two guys offering the same amount of resources, a woman would go for a monogamous status rather than polygynous. So, clearly they have some preferences for monogamy under some circumstances. And clearly there are other things that women see in men other than their money and their wealth. But we don't have systematic measures of them. And given that wealth explains so much of the variation, one is less tempted to start looking at those things. Now, that's not to say they're not looked at. There's a whole field of evolutionary psychology. And I think, somebody was asking me about it earlier. They've been talking about the sociosexual index, and psychologists working, or evolutionary psychologists working on those kinds of questions have, been interested in, digit differences, and when voice, deepness of voices, and height obviously is another trait. So there is a whole literature on what women prefer. Most of it comes from the West, from Western populations. And I have to say, maybe I'm just kind of too African in my viewpoint, but I've talked to so many people about marriage and marriage decisions and stuff, resources, material resources, security is so important in these environments. There are environments where there's disease, there's illness, there's droughts, there's floods. You really want a guy who's got stuff. And so I've kind of adopted their materialist approach, and I'm probably, as I said, too African on this.
Thank you.
Maren, I will apologize to you. I'd like to take first people who haven't asked a question yet. So we're going to go next to Tony Di Fiore. Tony?
Hi, Monique. Thanks for a really wonderful talk. This is Tony DeFury, University of Texas at Austin. I have to say I didn't say this at the beginning, but Monique was also, like Eduardo, one of my first instructors in graduate school and inspired me to work on behavioral ecology. So thank you. And Monique, I'll return to something that we talked about a lot in your classes 20 some years ago, intergenerational transfer of wealth accumulation, and how that intersects with mating systems. Maybe I missed it in the talk, or marriage system. So can you talk a little bit about kind of transgenerational wealth inheritance and its connection to marriage patterns?
Yeah, super good point. Nice to see you, Tony. Yeah, I think you're in the same seminar. We did discuss that. It's very, very important. And actually, I have a whole lot of work that I do together with Sam on intergenerational wealth transmission and how this contributes to inequality. So yeah, super important. But how it intersects with marriage systems, a good point. But I didn't mention at all. You're right. Polygyny inevitably dilutes wealth. If you have, I'm assuming, equal inheritance between for the kids of all of the wives. As I've said various times, there are different polygynous systems. Some of these Middle Eastern polygynous systems, only the first wife's kids inherit. So you're going to have totally different kinds of dynamics there. But in this, in the systems mainly that I've been talking about, the wealth is inherited by the sons of all of the wives. So polygyny is, some people say, well, it should be bringing equality, egalitarianism. That should be another. If you're going to give these talks about what a good thing polygyny is, why don't you point out that it brings egalitarianism as well? I wouldn't go that far because although it does break down wealth, and we actually know this from a lot of kind of social history, that powerful polygynous families only last 2 or 3 generations, and then everybody gets too little, and they don't do well. But there's many things going on. There's the transmission of wealth, but there's also the transmission of G, which was the non-rival wealth, right? Which is the man's genes or his status or his networks. And these sons of polygynous guys often inherit their social networks. They inherit their reputation. They come from, quote unquote, a good family. So wealth, remember, wealth is both created and inherited. I mean, you can inherit a certain something, but then what you get is going to make you more productive, because how much you earn is going to depend on how you were invested in as a child, and probably the resources you have to invest in your own education or whatever. This has been really nicely modeled by Alan Rogers in the 1990s, trying to tackle demographic transition. I think we looked at that too in that seminar. Nobody's really followed up on that stuff, but I think that's one of the things that drives the advantage of being the son of a polygynous man. Even if you don't get as much land and cows as you would like, you can still use this wealth to generate your own wealth. So I more widely than, because these systems are so different, I don't want to generalize beyond that. But I don't think polygyny creates egalitarianism. It clearly dilutes wealth, but it is a way of transmitting other characteristics of the male that may then help you to become, of your father, that may then help you to become wealthy in the future as a polygynous male.
So we're going to take one more question, and after that we need to give Monique a break, and big thanks. I mean, she has 2 hours of individual meetings with students and people in our group, so I want to give her a little bit of a break. But so we will finish. Tarun Kishore, your question is the next one and the last one.
Okay. So there was a really interesting talk. A lot of things I get to learn a lot of things today. So I'm Tarun Kishore Yomnam. I'm a PhD student at ISA Trivandrum, India. So my question involves a bit away from the other factors than material wealth when it comes to polygamous family. So I was wondering if the children, what is the effect of the children from a polygamous family? For example, if the child has been raised in a polygamous family, what does it affect to the marital status of the children in the later on? For instance, if the child has been raised in a polygamous family, does the child tend to go into a polygamous relationship later on? Or I was wondering about this because as a follow-up to Anthony's question, because you were also talking about the transgenerational inheritance of the wealth. So as in the case of the polygamous family, the offspring will have lesser and lesser wealth if there is equal division. But then you said that the social network can have an important aspect also. So what kind of influence will it have, the parental marital status to the children's marital status?
Yeah, good point. And I didn't address that in my answer to Tony's question. In the only place that it's been looked at, which is the KipZiggys, we found no father-son association, that if your father was polygynous, you are more likely to be, which at the time I put down to the dilution of resources. I guess, another model for polygyny, right, is the sexy son hypothesis. I had it on a slide, but I didn't actually talk about it. But when we think about the fitness, how you measure fitness, when you think of woman's fitness as a result of being in a polygynous marriage, you may not have more children, you may even have less children, but if your sons are inheriting the genetic type of your husband, and they're, this idea of sort of sexy son, that then your son is more likely to become polygynous, so you'll get more grandchildren. I look, that's what kind of motivated me to look and see if there was any association between son and father, and there wasn't. So, but so many of these questions are really good questions that an anthropologist can just answer from their one population, which, I at least see as being really, really a weak answer, because we need to know this systematically across different populations to know whether and why, under some circumstances, a polygynous father is more likely to have a polygynous son. And we could speculate it will be maybe a population where wealth is less important to female fitness and survival, and therefore she's going to be selecting more on this non-rival wealth, these qualities of males that may affect the fitness directly of her sons. And as I said, we don't have enough on this non-rival wealth with these in these 29 populations to be able to address that. But it's a super good question, and just highlights again the weakness of, despite the fact we're, for about 8 or 10 years now, we've really been trying to get this more systematic, individual-based comparative anthropology going. We still don't have many answers to these really good questions.
Thank you very much, Monique, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for staying with us for almost an hour of motivating, exciting questions and answers. So with that, I'd like to just remind you that invite you to join us next Tuesday. And like I said, let's give Monique a little bit of a break. Monique, I've made you a host. That way, okay, you can stay in this Zoom session as you meet with the people that you're meeting. Dr. Alba Garcia de la Chica is your first meeting at 1. So thank you, everyone, and we will be seeing you next Tuesday. Now we leave the session to Alba and Monique when they get together again at 1.
Great, thank you. Bye.
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 Bye, Susan. Hi, Susan, how are you? You're muted.
I just sent you a little chat saying also.
Oh, I haven't been following the chat. There's too much going on.
You can't while you're talking. No, I was just saying how this brings back fun memories of EHB tea time.
God, that's right. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I know. I never took a grad dinner from you, but I did learn an awful lot from you and Tim during my first year of grad school. And I was,
God.
just
forgotten you were at EHB. That's right. This really does go back 12 years.
Yeah.
I haven't presented this, I literally haven't presented KipZiggys data for, I mean, I use it in classes, but I haven't presented it in a kind of formal seminar. And I felt so, I mean, literally those figures were made with Letraset. It's just incredible, but it's kind of interesting to come back to, you know, with this so much more sophisticated approach that I've learned from Sam and, you know, MPI and all the great people I collaborate with. So, yeah, and then you look at these Letraset figures, you really shudder.
Well, no, they're still good figures.
They're still right, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's great you're collaborating with all those MPI people. I'm going to make a little pilgrimage there in January and try to get them to collaborate with me too on a bunch of stuff. Just running a continuous long-term field site takes up all my time, and I don't have time to learn all these fabulous skills. I'm just trying to attract.
That's my problem too. Yeah, and you work with these great, and Cody is just like, he's a dream. I mean, he's in Colombia at the moment, so I can't rely on him, but he is just fantastic. And yeah, I mean, I've had so many great collaborators. It's really fun because you just learn so much, you know. Without having to do too much work.
Postdocs over there hoping they can pick up those skills and bring them back to me. Yeah. Well, I don't want to cut into your next appointment, but it was lovely to see you. And,
nice to see you. Yeah, great.
Post-COVID sometime. Bye.
Yeah, really. Welcome in Britain anytime.
Thanks.
Alba, because I'm in a friend's house, can I just pop upstairs and go and get a glass of wine because it's 6 o'clock?
Absolutely. I just wanted to try if you can hear me because I have this terrible storm, like.
No, it's fine.
At my house, okay, perfect.
It's a little bit fuzzy, but I can definitely hear you. So I'm just going to get myself a drink, and I'll be back.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Hey, David, I'm not a host, so I don't know how to do that. I think Monique is the host now. Just mute it.
Can you hear me? I can't hear you at all.
You can't hear me?
No, but I don't have my headphones.
Okay, I can hear you. I can hear you.
I can hear you now. I don't know how to turn this off. I think maybe you have to make me a host.
So I don't know how to do that.
You're not the host.
I'm with a super delay. I told that like 5 minutes ago. Hi, Monique. So
Hi, I'm back.
A little problem because the live on YouTube is still on and we cannot shut it down. So we're trying to figure that out.
What happened? Sorry.
David, can you explain that?
You're still live on YouTube. So I think you as the host can somehow turn off the live streaming, or you can make me or Alba a co-host, and then we can try to figure out how to shut that off.
Huh. I can't see how to do it. I've got live transcript, but that's not it.
No.
I think maybe where it says it's in the upper left-hand corner.
Oh, live.
If you can click on that banner.
Oh, yeah, you're right.